Hello everyone, and welcome back to Ripe Stories. Imagine if a controlling HOA Karen prevented you from setting up solar panels, insisting it went against the community guidelines. Let's jump straight into today's video and examine this featured story from Reddit's r/justnoho. The story begins. I decided to vent about this online since everything concluded last week, and I've been eager to share this experience with someone. About 2 years ago I relocated to an HOA community. Yes, I was fully aware of all the drama and issues that typically arise with homeowners associations when house hunting. And yes, I understand there are countless discussions here about how terrible HOAs can be and how their boards are packed with power-hungry individuals who restrict what you can do with your property. The region I wanted to live in was filled with HOA communities, so my task was simply finding the most suitable one. When I discovered one that caught my interest, I conducted thorough research. I questioned the board about their expectations for new residents. By the way, everyone, sorry if my voice sounds slightly off, I'm still recovering from being sick, so please be patient with me. I spoke with several neighborhood residents about their HOA experiences and how long they'd been living there. I was pleased with what I discovered. The fees seemed reasonable, and there were residents who had lived in the community for more than 10 years without problems. Plus, when someone offers to handle snow removal, I'm definitely not going to decline that offer. The property I purchased was a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom home with a compact front yard that didn't cost me a fortune. Since I planned to make some improvements to the property, I made certain to consult with the HOA board before proceeding with adding specific flowers to the front yard. I reviewed the bylaws before asking, just to ensure I wasn't inquiring about something outside the OA's jurisdiction. This particular OA covered extensive ground regarding exterior home modifications. Several months into living in my new residence, one issue I encountered was the high electricity cost from the company serving our neighborhood. Shopping for alternatives didn't yield any favorable deals, so I decided to try a different strategy: solar panels. I examined the HOA bylaws and found nothing prohibiting solar panel use or installation. I may have acted hastily in seeking informal approval for solar panel installation, as I sent a letter to the board, but they responded via phone call rather than their typical written response. The person I spoke with, one of the co-chairs named Cindy, confirmed it was acceptable. This would be the neighborhood's first solar panel installation, so she asked if I would recommend the experience to other residents considering the switch. I felt that was sufficient authorization to contact an installation company. According to the company, the process would take several days, but once completed, they would only need to return 3 months later to verify proper energy generation and that I was maintaining the panels correctly. They described it as a straightforward process, and I anticipated everything would be installed and cleaned up within the week. Then Karen appeared, name changed for privacy. She was also an HOA board member and confronted the panel installers while I was at work. I received a call from them shortly after, stating they were told to leave by an HOA board member because the installation allegedly violated regulations. When I returned home, I saw the company had packed up all their equipment and materials, except for a few items the caller said he would retrieve the following morning. I visited the HOA board the next day seeking clarification. Karen identified herself as the person who spoke to the company, and we had an exchange. Karen stated, "The solar panels you're trying to install are an aesthetic violation. Those unsightly contraptions on your roof would decrease the market value of the entire neighborhood." I responded, "Look, I sent you a letter and received a call from Cindy approving the construction." Karen replied, "Cindy doesn't represent the entire OA. You should have waited for official denial." I said, "All right, fine, I understand. That said, since you attempted to proceed with construction, I believe the board should consider what fine you'll need to pay to correct this." I continued, "The construction never proceeded. They literally did nothing to the house before you came over and made them leave." Karen insisted, "Still, the fact that you thought you could go around us requires punishment." I argued, "There's literally nothing in the bylaws about solar panels. If you're going to penalize me for this, you need to show me where I overlooked that information. Because if there's nothing I missed, you're simply fabricating rules. I'll contact a lawyer and won't pay any fine." Karen responded, "There are bylaws concerning solar panel installations. Get your lawyer and we'll resolve this through them." I returned home and immediately contacted my attorney for assistance. I reviewed the bylaws again, checking for anything mentioning aesthetic regulations on solar panels, but found nothing. I made sure I was examining the most current version of the bylaws, not something from years past. My lawyer advised me to research the area's laws regarding solar panels and whether the HOA had authority to prevent their installation. I live in Ohio, and the most recent legislation they enacted regarding installation stated that an HOA could prohibit solar panel installations through a declaration requiring a vote by the entire neighborhood. However, it appeared Karen and the board hadn't done this, and Karen was simply trying to intimidate me into abandoning the solar panel installation. I had the lawyer examine the HOA bylaws more thoroughly to ensure I hadn't missed anything else, and I called the solar company back to tell them not to cancel the construction yet. I informed them about the law my lawyer and I discovered, and said they would return to the house later that week to install the panels. I returned to the OA board later that week to present our findings, asserting there was no bylaw about solar panels and their installation. If they wanted to prevent solar energy from coming to the neighborhood, they needed to hold a vote. As things stood, nothing prevented me from continuing with construction and getting the panels installed. Karen was furious, telling me that if I tried to bring the construction company back, I would be fined. I asked her about the fines she had threatened me with initially, and she said she would fine me for not following HOA guidelines and disobeying HOA decisions. I reminded her about the state law and said if she tried to fine me, I would respond with legal action. I really didn't want to go to court, but if she continued this behavior, I would do it. I left and ensured my lawyer knew she wasn't backing down. Then came the social media posts. Karen was a Facebook enthusiast and posted frequently on the show group on that platform. She launched something of a defamation campaign against me, subtly suggesting there was someone in the neighborhood who didn't take HOA decisions or bylaws seriously, and someone like that shouldn't be permitted to live in this community. Several people liked her post and expressed support for her, completely without context about what actually happened between me and the HOA board. She made no mention of solar panels, so many people sided with her due to her ambiguous language. I decided that approaching the HOA board directly wasn't sufficient. I had my lawyer send a letter on my behalf, citing state laws once more and threatening a lawsuit due to ongoing harassment and fine threats. My lawyer was then contacted by the HOA's attorney, who read the letter and wanted to confirm whether the entire HOA board opposed my solar panels or just certain members. My lawyer identified Karen as the primary instigator, also providing printouts of the Facebook discussion she was having with other neighborhood residents about me. She did mention my name in the post comments, not in the post itself, and it was obvious I was being directly targeted. The HOA attorney approached the board and informed them they were violating state law by preventing me from installing solar panels. He even brought me into a meeting with the board and reviewed several bylaws that Karen tried to convince him pertained to solar panels and solar energy. None of them actually addressed that topic or even other forms of alternative energy, so nothing in the bylaws could prevent me or other neighbors from using solar, wind, or even hydroelectric power for our homes. The board issued a formal letter to me the following day, acknowledging I was correct and stating I should be able to install solar panels on my house according to state law. The company returned the day after to officially begin work, and as I write this, I have proper solar energy powering my home. Karen had to remove her Facebook post and apologized to me on the HOA page, as well as during the next neighborhood meeting. She didn't appear very remorseful when she did so, but I assumed she was just trying to preserve her reputation. I accepted the apology, thanked the board for hearing me and my concerns, and then requested to become an HOA board member to ensure bylaws and state laws were being followed throughout the neighborhood. I somewhat surprised myself with that request, but I didn't want another person to endure what I experienced to get justice. The board had just lost a position as I'm writing this because Karen resigned. Wish me luck that I can secure the vacant spot. It appears OP might become the antagonist in the story instead of the Karen who just resigned. Just kidding, of course! I understand why OP is doing this. However, I'm curious if you were in OP's position, would you have also attempted to join the HOA board and essentially become one of them? Let me know in the comments. The next story is another absolutely crazy homeowner association tale titled, Can the HOA Steal My Dad's House for Failing to Mow His Lawn? I've been reading ARG legal advice for years but never imagined I'd be posting here myself. What's happening to my father seems so ridiculous that I can hardly believe it's real, but here we are. My dad is about to lose his home of 23 years over lawn maintenance. I'm desperate for any legal advice you can provide. My father, 68, has lived in the same suburban neighborhood since I was young. It's one of those areas with wide streets, similar-looking houses, and a very active HOA. Growing up, he was always meticulous about maintaining our house in perfect condition. He would spend weekends on ladders cleaning gutters, resealing the driveway, or trimming hedges into perfect shapes. The yard was his pride and joy. Things changed about 3 years ago when his health deteriorated. He was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes that rapidly progressed to requiring insulin. Along with that came neuropathy in his feet, making standing and walking painful. Last year he also developed diabetic retinopathy that impacted his vision. The medical bills hit hard. My dad was already retired and living on a fixed income, and suddenly he was facing thousands in out-of-pocket expenses. He had to make difficult decisions about what he could afford. I never thought I'd have to choose between medication and home repairs. He told me one evening last spring, but what good is a perfect house if I'm not around to live in it? I live about 3 hours away with my own family, and while I try to visit as frequently as possible, it's difficult to be there consistently enough to maintain his property. I've offered financial help, but he's always been stubbornly independent. This is my problem to solve, he insisted. You've got your own family to worry about. The trouble with the HOA began with a warning letter about 14 months ago. It cited several violations: shingles coming loose on the southeast corner of the roof, brown patches in the lawn, oil stains in the driveway, and naturally overgrown grass. The letter threatened daily fines if these issues weren't addressed within 30 days. When I visited that weekend, I could see the problems weren't major. The lawn needed work, yes, and there were some patchy areas and it was somewhat overgrown. A few shingles indeed needed replacing, and there were some small oil stains on the concrete, but nothing that would be noticeable in most neighborhoods. Apparently these are serious violations in the HOA's view. I spent that entire weekend working on the house. I mowed the lawn, cleaned the driveway with a rented pressure washer, and even climbed up to fix those damn shingles. My dad supervised from a lawn chair, looking both grateful and embarrassed. You know who's behind this, don't you? He said as I was loading my car to leave. It's that new HOA president. He's had it in for me ever since I voted against his proposal to increase our annual dues. I didn't think much of it at the time. HOAs can be petty, but surely they wouldn't escalate a minor property dispute into something so serious. I was wrong. Despite our weekend cleanup, the HOA sent a second violation notice 6 weeks later. This time they cited cracks in the driveway and claimed the lawn still didn't meet standards. I was skeptical, so the next time I visited, I took a walk around the neighborhood with my phone, discreetly photographing other properties. What I found was revealing. Several homes had similar or even worse issues. One board member's house had a driveway that looked like a spider web of cracks. The HOA president's next-door neighbor had patches of dead grass that made my dad's lawn look like a golf course by comparison. When we didn't immediately fix the new so-called violations, the HOA board began imposing daily fines on my dad. The fifth per day adds up quickly, let me tell you. My dad tried to appeal the fines at an HOA meeting, but the board was unmoved. Rules are rules, the president said coldly. If you cannot maintain your property to community standards, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you. Within 3 months, the fines had reached nearly 400,000, and the HOA then placed a lion on the house and began legal proceedings to collect. That's when this nightmare really began. My dad tried representing himself initially, filing motions to dismiss based on selective enforcement and failure to follow proper procedures. The judge seemed unimpressed though, allowing the case to proceed despite evidence that other homeowners with similar issues weren't being fined. By this point, I was seriously concerned. I started making weekend trips every other week to maintain the lawn and house. The property was now in better shape than most in the neighborhood, but the HOA still wouldn't drop the case. Instead, they kept adding to their demands. They offered to settle for $8,000. Dad told me over the phone, his voice tight with stress. That's almost all I have left in savings, and for what? Some brown grass and a few cracks in concrete. This is extortion. He finally found a legal aid attorney, but the guy seemed overwhelmed and unprepared. At the last hearing, he forgot key documents and couldn't effectively counter the HOA's arguments. Meanwhile, the HOA had hired an aggressive law firm that specializes in property disputes. That brings us to today. The trial is scheduled for Monday, and the HOA is now demanding over $100,000 and claiming it represents their legal fees and accumulated fines. It's an absurd amount that would force my dad to sell the house he spent his life paying for, the house where I grew up, the house where my mom died 5 years ago. Yesterday, I was helping my dad organize his paperwork when he suddenly sat down heavily in his recliner. I don't understand why they're doing this, he said, his voice cracking. I've lived here for more than 2 decades. I've served on committees, volunteered for neighborhood cleanups. I thought these people were my community. I didn't have the heart to tell him what I suspected, that the HOA sees his house as an opportunity. Property values in the area have skyrocketed, and a forced sale would likely mean a newer, wealthier resident moving in. The lawyer has been of little help, by the way. When I called him yesterday to go over case strategy, he seemed distracted and kept putting me on hold to deal with other clients. Look, he finally said, these HOA cases are tough. The courts tend to enforce the contracts homeowners signed even when the enforcement seems harsh. So here I am, Reddit. The trial is Monday. My dad is facing the loss of his home over lawn care issues that have already been fixed. We have documented the selective enforcement with photos and timestamps. We have records showing we addressed the original complaints, but the HOA keeps moving the goalposts and the legal system seems to be letting them. What should we do? Is there any legal strategy we've missed? Any way to fight this that might actually work? I'm desperate for any advice you can offer. If you were in this position, what would you do? What would you suggest OP do? This is heartbreaking, to be honest. Comment said, lawyer here. Get the trial postponed immediately and find a competent attorney. Your father's health issues may trigger protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act. The HOA has a legal obligation to provide reasonable accommodation. Also, collect evidence from neighbors willing to testify about similar conditions on their properties without enforcement. Selective enforcement is a valid defense against HOA action. Fortunately, we have an update to the story. By the way, let me know in the comments if you enjoy these legal advice videos. To be honest, I really missed legal advice content, so I really enjoy reading from this subreddit. Also, give the video a like because that would help me tremendously. Thank you so much. After posting here, I immediately followed the advice to seek a continuance of the trial date. Thankfully, the judge granted a 1-week postponement, giving us precious time to find new representation. Using the resources several of you suggested, we found an attorney suitable for the task. She agreed to take the case with a reasonable retainer after reviewing our documentation. FOFBEF new legal strategy. Our new attorney immediately filed several motions, one for reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act given my father's documented medical conditions, another challenging the calculation of fines and legal fees, and a third alleging discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules. She also helped us collect formal statements from 5 neighbors who had similar or worse property conditions without receiving violations. 2 of them even agreed to testify if needed. One elderly neighbor confided that she had been afraid to speak up before because she feared becoming the next target. They've been trying to push out the original homeowners for years, she told us, especially the older folks on fixed incomes. New buyers mean higher dues and bigger budgets for the board to control. The most crucial piece of advice from Reddit was looking into whether the HOA had properly followed all procedural requirements before imposing fines. Our attorney discovered they had failed to provide proper notice and hearing opportunities as required by both state law and their own bylaws. This procedural failure became the cornerstone of our defense. When we finally had our day in court, our attorney was magnificent. She methodically presented evidence of the HOA's failure to follow proper procedures before imposing fines, selective enforcement with photographic evidence showing worse violations on other properties, the unreasonable nature of the $100,000 demand, my father's good faith efforts to remedy all issues once notified, and the need for reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. The HOA's attorney seemed stunned by our level of preparation. He kept shuffling through papers, looking increasingly uncomfortable as our evidence mounted. When questioned about the jump from an $80,000 settlement offer to a $100,000 demand, he struggled to provide any reasonable justification. The judge, who had seemed disinterested in my father's previous appearances, was now fully engaged and increasingly concerned by what she was hearing. "Let me understand this correctly," she interrupted at one point. "You are asking this court to authorize taking a man's home because his grass was too long, even though these issues have been remedied, and you believe $100 is a reasonable amount for legal fees in a case about lawn maintenance." The HOA attorney stammered something about covenant enforcement being necessary to maintain property values. "I'm well aware of covenant enforcement," the judge replied dryly. "I'm also aware of predatory practices and abusive process." After 2 days of hearings, the judge issued her ruling. She not only dismissed the HOA's case entirely but also invalidated all fines imposed, finding they had been improperly assessed without following required procedures. She ordered the HOA to remove the lion from my father's property immediately and issued a written reprimand to the HO board for their conduct. Most surprisingly, she awarded my father partial attorney's fees, ruling that the HOA's pursuit of the case after violations had been remedied constituted bad faith litigation. While homeowner associations serve legitimate purposes in maintaining community standards, she wrote in her opinion, they are not empowered to selectively target vulnerable homeowners or to use procedural violations as profit centers. The court finds that the association's actions in this case crossed the line from legitimate enforcement to harassment. The HO president looked shocked as we left the courtroom. Several board members avoided eye contact entirely. As for my father, he's been doing much better now that this stress has been lifted. Several neighbors have reached out to offer help with lawn maintenance, and one neighbor's teenage son now mows his lawn weekly for a modest fee. "I just want to live in peace," my dad told me last weekend as we sat on his front porch. "I never want to be at war with my neighbors again." Before we end the video, we'll read one last story from our pet revenge. It's titled, "He kept trying to one-up me at work, so I let him take the job that nobody wanted." I worked at a restaurant where we hired this guy who thought he was hot stuff. I was the shift lead who just got a raise, and he couldn't stand it. He ignored my instructions constantly, challenged me, and acted like he ran the place. So I casually mentioned a manager role I was considering at a cursed location no one wanted. He applied just to flex and got it by default. He ended up working 120 hours a week with garbage pay and no overtime, while I chilled on easy shifts making bank. The store shut down eventually, he got moved, and I'm still smiling.
Thank you for watching.
Please check out my endless playlist on the left, and I'll see you again.